Hello, I am Dr. Bonnie Sullivan, psychologist. I am currently in Calgary, Alberta, in Canada, and this is my introduction video. So, originally, I am from California in the US, in the northern parts. People always ask where. And I lived in San Francisco for about 10 years, and that is where I did my graduate degree and my postdoctoral work. And that is where I had my first private practice. For this introduction video, what I'm going to do is just walk you through a little bit of where it all comes from and where I started. When I was 15 years old, I was part of the academic decathlon class. And for that class, I had to do a speech, and I chose to do a speech on child abuse. And while I was doing the research on child abuse, I was overcome by what people do to children. I couldn't believe that people would hurt children like that. And I still have images to this day that are in my head from some of the things that I read. And so I decided at that point in time that I had to save the children, and I wanted to do something, anything that I could do to help. And I decided that becoming a psychologist was the best way to do that. And so I decided to be a psychologist at that point in time. Now, to be fair, my entire life, I've kind of been a psychologist, just because I learned very early on how to be there for other people, how to support people. I had people around me who were struggling with things like depression and suicidality and trauma and abuse and all sorts of things like that. And so I just kind of learned very early how to be there for people. And so when I wrote that speech and when I did the research on it, it really was just the next step in my journey. So when I was 18, I did a little bit of work. There was an autistic boy in town, and his parents just needed someone to be a companion for him and to spend time with him. So that was my first client. Before that, I was a peer counselor, so I did actually help people in the high school, with peer counseling. I was 16 when I talked down my first suicide, because one of the counselors sent a student to me, not realizing that she was suicidal, and sent her to me so that maybe I could help her feel better because she was depressed. And then I found out she was suicidal, and well, she survived. So something was right, even though I didn't really have any training at that point, obviously. So then when I went to university, I studied psychology, and I did a lot of volunteer work. I was working with children. I worked with children who were in a home because they had been taken out of their own homes for various reasons, neglect and abuse and that sort of thing usually. And so I was volunteering there with those children. I also, when I ended up back in San Francisco, I was working at a shelter for women who were in abusive relationships. So I did that work as well. And that was when I actually discovered my love for that. And one of the things that I realized around that time, was it then? Yeah, I think it was in my undergrad years. I realized that it's the parents who have a lot of the choice about what happens with children. They don't have a lot of choice. So you can help them feel better. Certainly you can help them develop through this and be more resilient. But you can't solve the problem that way. And so I thought, well, if I work with people who are the parents in these situations, maybe I can help them, and then they won't put their children in situations where they get abused, or they won't abuse them themselves. And so I worked for some time with people who were in violent relationships. I worked a lot with women. And I also continued my work with autistic children when I was in undergraduate work. But really, I discovered my love there was actually working with the women who were in these violent relationships, a lot of whom had actually experienced quite a bit of abuse themselves throughout their lives for various reasons. And so that was something that I did for a while. When I was in graduate school, part of one of my practica, one of my practica was I worked at the VA. Anyone in the school that I went to and in the area that I went to, oftentimes you go to your practicum at a VA hospital somewhere. It's a really good place to get trained, especially if you're interested in trauma. And of course, I was. So I was at the National Center for PTSD in Menlo Park, California. And I was working and doing assessment there. I was doing some research. I was doing some group therapy work there and learning about group therapy and various things. And one of the things that I did there during the assessment was I would hear the veterans talk about their experiences, about what the trauma was for them. And of course, for a lot of them, it really was while they were in a war zone, in firefights. They had to do with the war, whatever war they'd been part of. But one of them had experienced had like a flashback, and harmed a child. And of course, coming from my background of wanting to protect children, your assumption would be that I would have a hard time with that. And a lot of therapists do become very angry with people who hurt other people. And I found that I was able to actually be with him through it and to have empathy for him. I didn't get angry with him. I didn't feel any blame for him or any judgment at all, really, which is, it's a little surprising even for myself to experience that, but I really didn't. And when I realized that I was able to work with him and be with him through that in a very authentic way, I truly did not feel any judgment or anger towards him. It made me realize that maybe I should also look at working with the people who are directly harming people, children and others as well. So I decided to look into that. And when I did my pre-doctoral internship in Denver, Colorado, I worked in a program with perpetrators of domestic violence. And I did some work there. And I found that I was able to do that fairly well. And so when I got to my postdoctoral internship, I had a choice between a neuropsychological postdoc, because I was interested in neuropsych and had done all the classes and everything, or working with ex-offenders. And these were mostly sexual offenders. And I chose that one because it really is where my heart is, with the trauma and with wanting to actually help people who have been through things like this. And I saw it as being very preventative as well. And that was my key. That's what pulled me in. And so I worked with these people for a year. And during that time, as long as I prevented even one victim, that year was well worth it. And it was 40 hours a week, and I was commuting 4 hours a day on the train to get there because I didn't live in San Francisco. And I was also studying to take my test, my licensing exam. And so that was quite the year. But it was a pretty amazing year, and I did end up staying on and going back and doing some work with what they called the difficult resistant deniers group, which is the group of people who really were not willing to work with the clinicians as much. They weren't really willing to face that they had done something to harm someone. And I worked with them for another, I don't know, a couple of years, I think, a year or two, something like that, after my postdoctoral internship and after I was licensed. And then I had my private practice. I started my first private practice there while I was also working with the sex offenders. And then I was also working, doing assessments with people in a long-term care facility, mostly older people, doing a little bit of therapy, but mostly they just wanted me to do assessment there. And I did a little bit there. And then I started my private practice as well. And then in 2005, I got married, and I married someone from Canada. And that's how I ended up here. So now I'm in Calgary. I'm no longer with the person I married, but I have two beautiful children, and they live here, and he lives here. So I live here too. And I have been in Calgary since 2006. And during the time that I've been here, I have been in private practice a couple times, but I've also worked at the operational stress. Well, I consulted at the operational stress injuries clinic here for veterans, just because once you work with veterans, you realize, or at least I did, I just love veterans, and I've always enjoyed working with them. So that was an opportunity for me to make a difference with the veterans here. So I did that, and I enjoyed that as well. And then I've also so I started working with borderlines here, and I learned the DBT. It's technique, it's a program. There's a lot of skills involved. There's a lot of work involved for the clinician to really, truly do DBT well. So I did that here. I got trained here in Calgary, and I have been working with DBT and doing DBT since then, and that's been a real blessing in my life, and I think my clients as well. DBT is a very effective therapy. And then recently I left the family psychology place, which I worked at for a few years as well. It was a great blessing to be there amongst the clinicians at the family psychology place, and now I'm back in private practice. As of September of 2022, I went back into private practice. I think that's pretty much the general overview. Obviously, there's been a lot more since then, since I did graduate in 2003, so it's been a while. That was when I got my PhD. So it's been a while that I've been doing this, and of course, there's a lot of things that happen along the way and a lot more. But that's all technical details, and you're free to ask me. I'm happy to answer. I don't like to keep things hidden around these things. It's not a secret what I've done with my professional life. So feel free to ask, and I hope that gives you a little bit of a background and an understanding of where I come from.